Fine. Thank you very much. So thank you very much for the organizers for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here tonight, and especially to Professor Robert Lee, who has contacted me, I believe, already 2 years ago about this quite fascinating topic. Just very briefly, I'm a landscape architect and a garden historian, and I work at the SIVA Foundation in Brussels, which is mainly an archive center for architecture and landscape architecture, but also a museum. That means that we do research based on our collections and archives, and regularly make exhibitions and publications on the basis of the research we do in-house, but also externally. So it's mainly pertaining to the Belgian geographical area. And the reason we started investigating the public parks and infrastructures in Brussels and try and retrace the history was an exhibition we organized with my colleague Eric Hainaut in 2018, and which was the starting point of a quite thorough investigation into this quite sort of interesting and very varied evolution of the infrastructure in Brussels. The exhibition was also the occasion of developing a couple of graphic tools and analytical tools in order to better understand how this evolution took place. Of course, today I'm going to focus on the 19th century because this is the theme of the conference. This map is showing different periods of evolution. The periods that we are really going to be focusing on is shown in brown here. And as you can see, even visually, it's a very important phase of evolution because you see some really large scale parks being created during that period, but also infrastructures connecting them, big tree-lined avenues, which I'm going to present you in the following slides. The main points I'm going to focus on in this very short time that I have to present you the theme today are international influences, because Brussels is really at the crossroads of many different types of international inputs when it comes to landscape architecture. The type of circulation of models, the transmission modes, how do these models come and percolate to Brussels? The different morphologies we meet along the different centuries and how they interact and interlace, and also try and question what are the motives behind creating public parks, what are the driving forces leading to the creation of public green spaces in the Brussels case, of course. As I said, our research for the exhibition also led to a book publication in which we identified 8 main periods of development starting in the 18th century. I think there already has been quite some debate about the notion of public park and sort of the modern concept of public park. For instance, with Christoph Fatzer's presentation and the Volksgärten in Germany. Maybe just to add to the debate, in Brussels, the creation of the first public park dates back to the 18th century, thus is earlier than the 19th century, and is still happening under the rule of the Habsburgs, the House of Habsburg, since we were still in the Austrian Netherlands. For the creation of important infrastructures, landscape infrastructures in Brussels, I have highlighted in purple the periods that are really the most relevant and which, as it happens, are also the periods relating to this conference, which is the 19th century. Just to put things in perspective, but these things have already been mentioned in previous interventions. Of course, the 19th century is the period of industrialization, the spreading of industrialization over many countries of this world. Correlated with this is, of course, an increasing urbanization, leading to the extension of cities and a growing distance from the countryside, which also makes necessary the reintroduction of nature into the cities, and also, of course, health issues, also, again, closely related to the densification of cities. So these are often mentioned as main driving forces behind the creation of public parks in several countries. We will see that maybe in the Brussels case, this is not necessarily the main background, but this is why I thought it was worth mentioning it in summing up. So, as I said, we're starting in the 18th century, which sees in Brussels the creation of the Parc de Bruxelles, which is directly adjoining to what is now the Royal Palace, before Belgium was a nation and a kingdom. And it is shown here on this map as the dark green rectangle, which is situated within the Pentagon. You see the Pentagon corresponding to the medieval city walls of Brussels. So we see it's the first public park created within old medieval city walls, which is maybe also a little bit of an exceptional case compared to other European examples where big public parks tend to be created out with medieval city fabric, since these are the places of expansion and where there's space available above all. As I said, we're still in the period of the Habsburg monarchy, and the park is a project of the government, so it's publicly financed, and it is a park that is meant to be for the enjoyment of the city population. We are in the middle of the age of the Enlightenment, so really the idea of enlightened elites creating a park for the benefit of the population is at the center of the reflection. So it's a space for leisure, walks, and also health. As you can see from this plan dating from 1780 and drawn by the Austrian gardener and forester Joachim Zinner, who came from a gardener family working for the Habsburgs. We are obviously in a very geometric French Baroque style type of typology, which is also explained by the fact that the park was designed jointly by French architect Barnabé Guimard and Joachim Zinner of Austrian origin. What is interesting in the creation of this park is also the idea that this park is a center of future urbanization projects. So really it's like a vector and a starting point for organizing the city around it. What you see on this plan are the diagonals of the pas de doigt, which literally project beyond the boundaries of the park. And in the following centuries, these axes will be prolonged and will give rise to new neighborhoods, which are completely organized along these park and thus landscape axes, which become urban axes once they go into the city. I included a couple of excerpts from the park regulations edicted in 1790, where there's all sorts of things you shouldn't do that you shouldn't do. So when you practice, when you do the experience of the park, you should, of course, obey all of set of rules, but still it is a park open for the public under the condition that you obey the rules. This bird's eye view, I thought expressed in a quite striking way also the idea that the park axes connect and project into the city. We can see the strong diagonal axis, but also the transversal axes are interesting because on the bird's eye view, you can see they project on the left into what was then a countryside. And the tree alignment, which runs parallel to the buildings, is already the old medieval city walls replaced by a boulevard, a planted boulevard. And on the little plan on the left, which is of a much later date, you can see how these projecting axes have become streets around which are organized new neighborhoods and building plots. The 19th century, of course, sees the expansion of the city and the creation, like the related creation of several public parks, of which I will very briefly explain the background. What is shown in light green on my slide here corresponds to this period. So we see the replacement of the ancient medieval city walls by a tree-lined boulevard. And we see these, one of the parks is grafted directly onto this green ring, whereas another one is situated more on the east, and we will look into it. On this plan dating from 1844, you quite clearly see how this boulevard, which replaced the ancient city walls, must have been a real landscape horizon for the city, creating this very powerful infrastructure, literally embracing the city. And you can also see from the scale that the original park, Parc de Bruxelles, is of quite a large scale. And the park, which is grafted here on the right of the plan, is a new botanical garden created in 1826, and which is directly grafted onto this green infrastructure of the boulevard. The botanical garden in Brussels has a very clearly mixed type of morphology, where we have an upper part which is kept in a very formal geometrical axial style, whereas the lower part, which is here on the right, is designed in what we could define as something relating to the English landscape garden style. These two illustrations show this very contrasting part with the upper part, the circular axial geometry. And in the lower part, we have some quite evocative lithography here, also showing a little folly, which interestingly enough is a sort of camouflaging. It's hiding the actual steam engine, which is operating the water jet that is present in the middle of the pond. A second park from this first part or middle of the 19th century is a private enterprise, thus a commercial enterprise created by private actors, which is a zoological park, which had all sorts of attractions, which I'm not gonna dwell on here today, given the time, but which is interesting in that it's the first public park entirely created in what we can call the English landscape garden style in a very broad manner, characterized, of course, by winding paths, clumps of trees, wide water bodies, and lawns combined with a forest backdrop. This was designed by Louis Fuchs, landscape architect of German origin. And it is also to be noted that these parks were adding value to the land, and they were created before the neighborhoods around them. So they were also an encouragement for the rising bourgeoisie to build around the park. So again, the park acts as the vector for the surrounding urbanization of the city. Another initiative worth mentioning is one of the big axes in Brussels, which is Avenue Louise, which was created in 1868, but for which there were projects as soon as 1843, and which again is really public space designed for the benefit of the population and addressing all strata of population, and where the idea of strolling and enjoying also an aesthetic landscaped axis is very much present. We see, for instance, sculptures, but also decorative flower beds contributing to this idea of embellishment of the city, and not only an infrastructure. I'll briefly, can you just tell me how many minutes I have left?
Perhaps, I mean, you're already over.
Okay, well, I'll just do it intimate. So,
but 4 or 5 minutes more.
Okay, fine. So the reign under Leopold II is, as I mentioned, particularly interesting because we really see the creation of parks at scale hitherto unseen, as we can see in brown on this plan. It's also worth mentioning that it's contemporary to some of the main projects of Frederick Law Olmsted in the United States. Here are a couple of schematic plans of these parks. You can clearly see the English landscape style at work here with winding paths and water bodies. It is also worth mentioning that Belgium was a small country, but it really wanted to show on an international level that it was a big nation. It was a very strong industrial force. So it was also an ambition of the king to make his capital up to the ambition of the political and also economic power of the country, and green landscape architecture were part of this showcase and communication system. Here you see some big avenues, and I'll go through a couple of characteristic parks. You have here Le Bois de la Cambre, created in 1865, well, a long period of creation, with again a typical network of winding paths along a pond with an island, and which was created with by landscape architect Edward Keilig, again of German origin. Here, Parc de Laeken, also in the same style. Parc de Woluwe, which was created by Louis van der Swalmen and Eline Lenné. Eline Lenné, who is of French origin. And here, last one of the main parks, which is Parc Josaphat, which also shows very strikingly how the shape of the parks contributes to shaping the neighborhoods around, with curves and counter curves, literally defining the shape of the neighborhoods. So the channel of diffusions are very interesting. Of course, there were publications coming to Belgium, amongst which Les Promenades de Paris by Alphonse. So the French influence was very strong. We see there were some French landscape architects active in Brussels. We also see that the German presence of landscape architects brought in some models that obviously transited, how should I put it? I mean, the English landscape garden style disseminated from the United Kingdom to the continent, and it came to Brussels via different other countries, I would say. So it had already been a little bit transformed, and in turn it was readapted and reinterpreted in the Brussels context to bring about probably what we can call some specific new types of this typology.
I suspect we better bring your presentation to an end, although
yes,
I'm sure we'll go on and tell us lots more.
Yes, so
because you have to.
Thank you very much. And for those who wish to have a clearer insight into the topic, we have also published a book on this topic. Thank you very much.
Good, well, thank you. Because you have to leave before 7 o'clock, would it be sensible, Marie, if we took some questions now, rather than leaving Ursula at the end of the session, with no time to really participate and answer questions?
Yeah, sure. But if there are any questions.
I've got a quick question. I'm working on a book on Robert Marnock, who is said to have worked on Laken, on the transformation. Did you come across him?
Yeah, I think we exchanged about this. The information is really scarce, and I did look into it, but I couldn't find anything very conclusive. So I'm sorry, I can't elaborate.
Still not?
No, still not. No, I'm sorry.
Okay, out of luck.
We're on a new project right now, so we're not so much. So.
Okay. Could I ask?
I mean, I have the name in my head, and when I come across him, I'll let you know.
Good, thank you.
Could I ask a simple question? How have you defined a public park, particularly those that were created in the late 18th century? Because
well,
they had lots of rules. There must have been a dress code, a way of policing. And even in relation to the Avenue Louise, I suspect that here again, working class people were not necessarily welcome to be seen in that environment.
I'm not sure I have an answer to that, except that maybe one of the elements I can bring is that it was publicly funded and it was open without restrictions. So I don't know if in practice, maybe, you know, reality differed from theory, probably did, but the idea is being expressed like in written text that these spaces are really for the benefit of the whole population. Maybe, you know, it's certainly worth investigating what the real practice was and, you know, having a specific historic sociological approach, which we didn't get a chance to do, but I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I had the same question as Robert, only because in the United States, we tend to teach in history of landscape architecture and such that that Birkenhead was the first true public park in world history. And I think in part that's convenient because we know Olmsted went there and all of that. But it does beg the question, you know, how do we measure what is the first and how do we know?
I think, you know, it's really worth thinking about the definition and what makes it or what doesn't make it, or where do we draw the line, you know. I mean, as you said, social classes is certainly one of the main factors, but I think it requires very precise historical analysis in order to find that out. How would, you know, it's, you know, to find out, I mean, not much is written on by popular classes, so it's always a...
And do we know really enough about how, even within continental Europe, the markets for landscape gardeners functioned beyond national boundaries?
The markets, you mean the way that practitioners got contracts?
Yes, how they moved, how far they moved. What did they take with them and what did they bring back when they migrated?
Well, I mean, in the Brussels case, what is really interesting is King Leopold II was really quite passionate about city planning and about landscape, and he had a very thorough knowledge even of plants. I mean, he would go along avenues and, you know, tell people off if a tree wasn't being maintained properly. But so he was actually quite well informed about what was happening in other countries. And as I said, he was very interested in having a beautiful capital. And I'm not saying he went landscape architect shopping, but he certainly had an influence on, you know, the contacts with foreign landscape architects, and also the invitation to competitions. The first park I showed is Bois de la Cambre, and we had also Jean-Pierre Barillet Deschamps that made a project for it. And so there were 3 invited landscape architects, none of which were Belgian. So we had 2 German architects and a French architect. And of course, the royal family also had family connections to Germany. The Saxe-Coburg dynasty. So, I mean, through aristocratic circles, they must have known things, and through personal interest. In the case of the reign of Leopold II, which is a very particular period of the development of parks in Brussels, of course.
Thank you very much. So is it time for me to make a little brief presentation, do you think? Marie?
Robert. So I will share your PowerPoint.
On? Can we all hear each other?
Yes, can you hear us, Robert?
Yes, yes. Well, let's make a start because time is slipping by. I suppose this is part 1 of the Olmsted role and the process by which he picked up lessons from abroad, because, as I'm sure all you know, when he first visited Birkenhead Park in 1850, the impact was inspirational. His fulsome praise for the outstanding quality of Paxton's landscape design and the vision of the improvement commissioners in creating a publicly funded urban park with a commitment to maintain it in perpetuity is well known. Gardening had reached a perfection that he had never before dreamed of. Within 1 year, the skeleton of this delightful garden was complete, and it had been achieved by the generous spirit and fearless enterprise of its honest owners. And as we know, what Olmsted took from his brief visit to Birkenhead Park played a critical role in determining the design framework with Calvert Vaux of Central Park, New York, of Prospect Park in Brooklyn, and the role it played in turn by offering everyone, and I quote, a wonderful air of calm beauty. And from his brief encounter with Birkenhead's new park, Olmsted developed a framework for developing urban green space that would inspire reform-oriented politicians, city planners, landscape designers, park lovers, etc., throughout the world. And his design philosophy and social policy became virtually inseparable as a means of civilizing and democratizing America. Public parks were essential to the idea of democracy, and not only were they publicly owned, but everyone had an obligation or a collective interest in their preservation and enjoyment. Equally important, of course, although apparently not the case in Brussels, was the issue of health and the ability of parks and green space in general to provide refreshing and tranquilizing benefits. You can highlight these issues in what he wrote about Birkenhead Park. When it started to rain a little bit, he crossed over to what he termed the temple, i.e. the Roman boathouse, which he reported was on an island. And there the visitors came from different social classes. There were people who had the ability to send at once for their carriages. Others were professional and had notebooks and portfolios. But a huge proportion were, quote, of the common ranks. Equally important was the ability of Birkenhead Park, right from this date, to offer facilities for active recreation. On the day that he visited, there was a cricket match going on. Now, I suspect not all of you appreciate the complexities of cricket as an established sport, but there was a group of gentlemen and also a group of children. This, in fact, reinforced his arguments that the beautifully designed landscape not only promoted communitiveness, a social value that he believed would ultimately dissuade narrow individualism, but it also would enable people to live a healthier life. But how far really did this reflect reality? You could see it here on this slide. It was unreservedly and forever the people's own. The poorest British peasant is as free to enjoy it in all its parts as the British Queen. But Queen Victoria never came to Birkenhead Park. And if you look at the visitors, I don't see many examples of people dressed as peasants. We'll go to the next slide. And the closer you read what Olmsted wrote about property, the more you realize that there were so many errors. In fact, if it was an undergraduate thesis, it might actually fail. He claimed, for example, that the grand entrance with its handsome Ionic architecture was unsupported. He was fairly negative in his views about that. But if you look at the contemporary lithograph, it seems almost to be surrounded by plants, small trees. Next, please. And here again, you have a query, because what he actually, this on the right is the Roman boathouse, but it's not on an island. It's the Swiss bridge that's on the island. And it's not called a Chinese bridge, but after a type of the bridges constructed in Swiss towns like Locarno. Next, please. According to Olmsted, the land was a flat, sterile clay farm. But does that really look like such a situation, even though that's supposed to reflect how it looked before the big development? Next, please. And you can see quite clear evidence that that was not the case. Thanks to the tithe tax, you can, with some difficulty, trace who in fact was occupying this land. They were all tenants of the Lord of the Manor, Francis L. Price. And some of the holdings were extremely small, but you couldn't cultivate some of those crops on land that was, according to Paxton, swampy and on sand. Next, please. Well, you probably all can recognize Paxton's outline design, his first plan for Birkenhead Park, 1844. The structures that really defined it, structures that were assimilated by Olmsted and applied in Central Park and elsewhere. The binary divide between the upper park and the lower park, the different circulation routes so that pedestrians are kept apart from carriage folk, two lakes at the heart of the park, surrounded by mounds of varying height. Next, please. Next, please. And here are just some elements. Olmsted was right to emphasize the quality, the way in which paths veered from one direction to the next, always giving people a different visual sensation. But he had little to say about the grotto, and this grotto was built shortly after Paxton had constructed a larger grotto for the Duke of Devonshire, his employer. And nor did he appreciate the significance of the grotto, because in combination with the Swiss bridge and the Roman temple, what it was actually offering ordinary people was cut-price grand tour. So enabling people who probably haven't the money to take the ferry across to Liverpool to really enjoy something special that was normally restricted to the aristocracy. And in terms of bridges, what's interesting is that Olmsted was really impressed by the variety of bridges, but he described them all as being really undecaying material. They were robust and would last for years. And that might have been the case in relation to the iron bridge, but not in relation to any of the wooden bridges, because if you look at the accounts, they often required regular maintenance and renewal. Next, please. nor did he have very much to say about the lodges. In the end, 8 lodges constructed, and he was dismissive about the lodges. He said they were inconvenient lodges for laborers. That was far from the reality. They were all designed to reflect historic changes in dominant architectural patterns over time. And you can see 4 of them reproduced here. Next, please. And I've already referred to these most wise and worthy townspeople. But if you look beneath the surface, you find a totally different profile. 1839, only about 200 people, residents, house owners, qualified for election as an improvement commission. And that included 41 women, 1/5 of the total, who were automatically debarred because of their gender. Or if you look at the distribution of land, or the way in which wealth was accumulated by a small group of individuals, it's very clear that things were not democratic at all. And the creation of the park was not really driven forward by a democratization pattern. And they're all the same people by and large. John and William Jackson owned almost 20% of all the plots. The Laird family, 15.8%. And the total, I think, just of those 4 families was as high as 50% of all the landed plots in the town. And the extent of their financial involvement in the Birkenhead Dock Company was really, really substantial. £100,000 in total. I think that came to £250,000. Okay. But that also meant, and John will know more about this than I do, that they used, or should I say, they abused their powers to involve themselves in what we would term fraudulent activities. So they bought up a significant part of the land intended for the park prior to the fact that it was formally authorized. So they offered the lord of the manor price a very low value, and then sold it on to themselves as commissions at a profit of, what, 700% or more. And it's clear from what Jackson had to say was that this was actually a common practice amongst the businessmen. Next, please. And it was the same honest, wise, decent people who were responsible for constructing awful tenements. You'd be not surprised to find that these are from around 1900. The ones that were constructed in the 1840s were horrendous in terms of their health costs and the suffering that many ordinary people had to put up with. Yes, please. Nor did Olmsted, in any sense, look at the issue of access. It's a public park, but, you know, as you found in the question that I posed to Ursula, who could really have access to it? Now, it was a mile and a half, if not more, from Woodside and Hamilton Square, the centre of Birkenhead, but even further from new settlement developments, including factories to the east. So I don't know how long it would take him to walk from the Bromborough Pool Candle Works to Birkenhead Park, but maybe 40 minutes or something like that. So in a sense, it's not really physically accessible to many of the working class families in Birkenhead and the surrounding settlements. Next, please. It's a little bit unfair to put this in, but I thought, you know, as we have a number of American participants. Trains, street railway car, 1860, the first ever provided in Europe. Shouldn't go amiss. But again, it's an issue which raises a query about how access to Birkenhead Park changed over time in terms of infrastructure improvements. Yes, please. And here again, almost no provision was made for people to have anything to eat in the park, except for the refreshment rooms. 1852, 1853, very expensive, not accessible really to ordinary people. Next, please. And what about time? The reality in the 1840s and 1850s was really something that Olmsted was not in any way concerned with. And you can see standard 6 days a week, hours per day for the police constable who patrolled Oxton and Bidston, between 13 and 14.5 hours. Domestic servants and other categories really fully exploited. They couldn't have any leisure unless it was permitted by their employer. Next, please. And what about sports provision? I mean, I've now completed my work trying to track down all the sports that developed in the park. But contrary to Olmsted's view, when he encountered this cricket match, he failed to realize that almost all of them were for the upper middle class, for the privileged. And this applies to even bathing in the lakes, only permitted to gentlemen. Archery, the riding track of 1861, which took up half the upper park's carriage. It's not until you get to 1863 that ground was made available for the public, for teams organized by churches and things like that. Until that period, almost all of the space for sports is classified. Next, please. And here we have the Wirral Archers. You can tell they are not in any way working class. Archery was a royal sport. Remains so really for a long, long time. Next one, please. And one key factor that restricted the availability of land in the upper park was the economic necessity of earning revenue from tenants who grazed their sheep and other animals there. So even though theoretically there should have been adequate space for everyone, that was not the reality. Next, please. So if you look clinically at what Olmsted had to say about that, there are so many weaknesses, so many factual errors, so many misconceptions, but in essence, what he had to say, what became part of his ideology, still carried immense weight. He was so full of admiration for the concept, even if in reality it fell short of what he thought it was.
Thank you very much, Robert.
So should we move directly to, oh, John. You've got an immediate question.
John, you're on mute.
Done?
If you want to ask a question, you need to unmute yourself.
Yes.
John? We
Should we come back to that at the end? John, can you hear us?
John, can you try to speak again? As there is a problem with your microphone. It makes weird noise. No, I'm afraid.
Oh dear.
Technical assistance.
Is it working now, Marie?
Yes,
Yes.
it's
Oh,
perfect.
okay. My apologies.
No worries.
Obviously, I'm reliant on that. So, Robert, my question is, where does this fit in the broader scheme of things? This whole idea of a democracy and civility. I mean, my knowledge of history is limited, but I am aware that during that period of time, there was a whole movement to create what one I think called rational recreation, that one was the society was, or the upper class were concerned about the amount of alcoholism that was going on and the amount of drunkenness among the local people, and the pub was actually the local recreation center, and it was huge amounts of liquor, as I understand it, and so this was an era, as I understand it, when libraries and baths and mechanics institutes and so on were coming in. Is this part of that greater movement?
Almost all those significant improvements came in at a later date. You don't find public baths being opened in the 1840s or 1850s. You don't find most, if not all of the other elements really prioritized until a later point in time. Okay. Or do we still have problems with your mic?
Try to say something, John. I think it works fine. Do you want to say something, John?
Okay, you want me to move on? Okay,
yes,
can you set this thing up for me, please?
It works fine. You can
Yeah, hang on, I think we can do it.
Are we in communication now? No.
Yes, I think. John, do you want to start your presentation now?
I think I'm muted. Okay, am I good?
We can't hear you fine. Perfect.
So what do I do to press this? Hit this one? Okay, well, good. Okay, well, my presentation, well, first of all, my thanks to Robert. He introduced me to this whole area of the history of local parks back 20 years ago. He probably doesn't remember, but I met with him in his office and he inspired me to get involved in this, and has since given me good advice on all kinds of things. And in my formative years, I did play cricket at Birkenhead Park, playing for Hightown in the Liverpool competition. And so it piqued my interest. I'm really intrigued by Robert's great work here in identifying the powerful influence of the people who were doing this, because that really ties in with my own theme here. And I've learned much from the other people in this series of presentations, and it's been very valuable for me. But my concerns here, the adaptation of Birkenhead's financing model. Financing has been the thrust that I have adopted. And so this thing isn't working. So I do what? I press this one. Ah, there we go. And so one could argue that the first urban park, although of course it wasn't a public park, was Regent's Park. And without getting into all the ins and outs of that, which this audience, I'm sure, are well known, it was originally predicated clearly on Nash's financial data. And when he went into this thing, Nash said it would cost £12,000. It finished up costing £74,000, 6 times more than Nash expected. Nash told the commissioners of Woods that it would generate $45,000 in income, but in fact generated $13,000. So the numbers were way out of whack. It generated about 30% of what he projected, and the cost was 6 times greater. And that trend has really then pursued the other parks that followed, and there are 8 what I call bellwether parks. The first of them, the first 4 in London, Regent's Park, Victoria Park, Battersea Park, and Albert Park, which of course never got built, but nevertheless the work was done on it. And then the other next four bellwether parks were in Liverpool: Princes, Birkenhead, Newsham Stanley, and Sefton, which all came on together. And so in each of these cases, the same financial model was used as that was pioneered down at Regent's Park. It was a real estate development, and the intent was that the lots around the outside would generate sufficient income in order to pay for the park. And in all of these situations, it failed. In Birkenhead, and again, Robert should feel free to correct me, but my understanding of Birkenhead is that the cost estimate was 103,000, and depending on which contemporary estimate you take, the actual cost was 127 to 146,000. So it was probably a third to a half over what was estimated. And the revenues similarly came in well under what was anticipated, primarily because there was a recession and a depression in Birkenhead when they came on the market. But the point is that they did not pay their way. In each case, there were large cost overruns in these what I call bellwether parks, the major parks that were the models for the early British system, and low annual revenue flows. And it was a consistent pattern that came out over and over again. They were financial failures, although they were aesthetic and social successes in many cases. There was no hiding that they were financial failures. And so you look at that and you ask the question, did the early park designers, Nash, Pennethorne down in London, Paxton, Andre, Hornblower, and Kemp up in the Merseyside area, all of whose reputations were greatly enhanced by their work at these parks, did they strategically misrepresent the viability of their projects? In other words, when they came to do these studies and they consistently underestimated revenues and consistently underrepresented costs and overrepresented revenues, it seems to me doubtful that given their experience with these things, and some of these folks did several parks, they were naive about that. And I have no evidence per se to support that, except that it just seems to me incongruous they would do that. And Hugh Shimmin, who had a very satirical column in the Liverpool Press, which he wrote under the name of Porcupine, he actually voiced it, and he was a big supporter of parks in Liverpool. And yet when he came to Sefton Park, he concluded, it now appears that the committee, the council, and the community have been grievously misled in terms of the financial viability of the effort. And so that idea of parks generating income generating increase in property values around them was also adopted by many of the donors. Many of the early British parks were philanthropic. They were before the government-funded parks came online. They used the same kind of model. So you had Lord Vernon in Stockport with Pine Belly Park, which later became Vernon's Park. He donated the parkland, but he kept all the land around it. And so the city then paid for the development of the park, in essence, even though he donated the land. They developed it, looked after maintaining it, but his properties around it he kept, assuming they would increase in value. You had the same thing at Pearson Park in Hull, where Mr. Pearson did the same thing, received a lot of approbation for their donation, but they were doing well by doing good, kept control of it. The fact that it didn't work out for Mr. Pearson was evidence in that he finished up going bankrupt. Charles Hesketh in Southport, which was at Hesketh Park, was Kent Park, was similarly, he donated the land, but he kept all the properties around it because they were knowing they would go up in value. And Henry Balclough in Middlesbrough with Albert Park up there did the same thing. And so this model, before the British really had government authority, or before, even when that authority was granted, before authorities took up that authority, the philanthropists and the commercial real estate people were doing this work. Well, that's one of the things that Olmsted, and before him, Andrew Jackson Downing, who of course preceded Olmsted over in England and picking up ideas, and of course recruited Calvert Vaux to assist in Jackson's practice. Jackson, of course, was unfortunately killed in a steamboat accident on the Hudson. But he and Olmsted both brought over this model about parks didn't cost money, they generated money by the increased value around them. And this is a quote from, as you know, Central Park started in 1857. In 56, the hard-nosed New York City comptroller, who's the treasurer of the city, said this. He said, the increase in taxes by reason of the enhancement of values attributable to the Central Park would afford more than sufficient means for the interest incurred for its purchase and improvement without any increase in the general rate of taxation. In other words, New Yorkers, you can have this for free. There was a certain skepticism about that. And so as New York Central Park was built, every year they issued an annual report. The commissioners issued an annual report. And every year they reported the data. Now, this was the value of there are three wards bordering on to Central Park, 12th, 19th, and 22nd. And before the park started, these were the values of the real estate, 8, 8, and 10, coming to 26.4 million. Each year, they recorded the increase in value in each of those three wards. And so what I've got here is the final year in 1873, which is de facto when the park was completed, although there's no really official completion date, which showed the increase in value between the two periods of time. And so the increase in the assessed valuation of the properties was 209 million, the gap between the 263 and 26. Now, the tax rate in New York at that time was $2.50 per $100 assessed valuation. And so the tax revenue that the city gained from this increased tax base was $5.2 million. Now, the total cost of the land and development, the commissioners said, and there's some quirks about that, but that's what the commissioners said in their 87-3 report, was 13.9 million, and the debt on that, which was a 45-year mortgage, was $830,000 a year. And so they concluded that if we've got 5 million extra money coming in because of the increase in properties around the park, and that's the debt charge, there's a net, you can forget the last figure, the net is a $4.4 million profit annually. Those data were critical in the development of the parks movement in America, as we shall see. They were also hugely flawed, because what has happened is that they have attributed all of the increase in value to the presence of the park in those wards. Now, there was an increase of 250,000 people over this period of time. New York was densely populated down at the south island, at the end of the island. And so why did those people, those 250,000 increase, why did that happen in those wards? Well, the answer is not because of the park. The answer is because that's where the cheap land was. down in the dense part increased 7 times between 50 and 60 in there. So there's some challenges in that. So in addition to the fallacy of the figures, and let me just go back to those, the fallacy of the figures, you also had the streetcars coming in, so people could now quickly get down to the island from this straight part, and they also invested hugely in roads and pavement, and so you could easily move down the island. So this value wasn't, although Olmsted and his folks attributed it to the park, it actually was not. It was attributable to other factors. That did not inhibit Olmsted. There are some other insights into this. This is now 5 years after the park was completed, and it's put in the real estate journal, which, or the real estate magazine, whatever, which the real estate community was their Bible at that time. And they said New Yorkers were unwilling to live opposite the Central Park, this vast open space, which prevents so dreary and bleak an appearance in winters. Families dreaded the unwholesome influences emanating from such a large surface of unimproved land. And that's 5 years after it was supposed to have been finished, or de facto was finished. Tellingly, a letter which Charles Beveridge, who's been Olmsted's biographer and edited his letters and so on, rooted up and sent to me. Olmsted wrote a letter in 1877 to Charles Dalton. Dalton was the head of the Boston committee that was exploring the potential of a Boston park system. And as you know, Emerald Naturals finished up around Boston later. But in this letter, Olmsted wrote to Dalton, he said, "Land closer upon the park does not at present offer a desirable place for residence." Oops, I'm missed my place here. Here we go. Those who hold it do so with a view to demand which will come, for it from a small wealthy class when the city shall have grown out to the park, and it shall have been made convenient and wholesome by sewers, pavement, and flagging. In other words, in 1877, 5 years after this was finished, and long after they have been claiming all of these people came because of the park, Olmsted himself is writing saying, oh, but it was a pretty undesirable place at that time and there wasn't much action. The ripple effect of this was dramatic. Brooklyn, which of course was the 4th largest city in America, it was independent of New York at that time, decided they were going to replicate Central Park because it was a financial gain to the city. They also had commissioners who produced annual reports, and the 1867 report, which was about the 3rd or 4th annual report for Prospect, which of course was Olmsted's real gem of the park, reported the additional tax which was raised from this increased valuation for the year 1867 was $280,000. The interest on the whole park debt was $229,000, showing an increased annual income to the city from these 3 wards alone, those around Prospect, of $51,000. Parks didn't lose money. They made money for the city according to the way they were doing the calculation, which of course was false. In 1884 was the most influential day of urban parks in America. On that day, one day in April 1884, I think it was October 1884, New York created 6 new urban parks, totaling 3,600 acres in one day. The presidents of the city's 6 largest banks said, "We have no doubt that these parks would not only cost the city nothing, but would enrich its treasury with millions of dollars with which to meet the cost of other necessary improvements." For the same project, another letter which came into the New York Times, which was from, and I quote, 78 of our wealthiest men and largest taxpayers who signed this letter, and many familiar names on that, said, "The Central Park facts speak louder than any words, and they must be sufficient to convince the most skeptical." In other words, those facts, quote unquote, that Olmsted was spreading around from the annual reports were being used to convince people to build the parks. And so when you go and look, as I have in the archives of many of these cities, you see these same data, which I shared earlier on Central Park, being used to justify Golden Gate Park in San Francisco in 1865, the Chicago parks in 1869, Boston Back Bay Ferns in 1874, the Minneapolis Park System, which was started in 1883, used these data. The Buffalo Park System in 84, the Kansas City Parks and Boulevards System in 93, and the Cleveland Park System 60 years later is still using these Olmsted data. And they were used throughout America. They were spread not only by Olmsted, but all of his acolytes at this time, and of course by Rick Olmsted, Frederick Olmsted Jr., who took over the firm. And so this myth was perpetuated. It bears in mind that the 6 presidents of New York's bank and all of the wealthiest real estate people didn't recognize that. And of course, Olmsted himself recognized it. And so you're left with why? You're left with my opening question: does the end justify the means? The end is a marvelous park system, social success, but they got there by grossly misleading numbers. And you put it down to the growth machine, and there was a very well-known architect by Martouch in the sociology literature in 1976, when he coined the phrase, the growth machine. And he said, this growth machine comprises of landowners, real estate developers, lawyers, investors, engineers, mortgage bankers, realtors, construction contractors, cement suppliers, sand and gravel companies, building suppliers, media outlets, architects and landscape architects, and so on. All of these people have a vested interest in the city paying the bills to build a park because they all gain from it. And so does the end justify the means? And now, in addition to my professional life, I have to confess that I have a political life. And I'm on our city council, and in 3 hours' time, I'm going to a council meeting. And we are going to discuss requesting our voters to generate about $120 million for new parks in our community, new facilities in our community. Now, I have a dilemma. I'm a social scientist. As a social scientist, I should be giving them the pros and cons of the economics of this. As a politician and an advocate, I could cherry pick and pick the bits of the research that justify my case, which is what happens in most political arenas around here. You know, when people say research, they mean the bit that suits their interests. They don't say the rest of it. And so that's the conundrum. That's the dilemma. Does the end justify the means? There we have it, Marie.
Thank you very much. That was a very good presentation. Robert, are you still here?
I found it interesting that Ursula's earlier paper also, she kept alluding to the impact on the neighborhood around and building the neighborhood around the park. And it seems to me Maybe there was a sort of the same implicit idea there that you had real estate people capitalizing on the government's investment here and probably lobbying for it.
Yeah, I mean, it is great. I mean, but it's not just economics, is it, John? It's also sort of the physical presence, the people being able to go out, health benefits, other social benefits. So
Right.
yeah, I mean, you know, what do you, how do you cost these things? You know, is it purely this neoliberal model which you're sort of expressing here?
Yeah, I think, and that's the point, isn't it? Yeah. These are social, by definitions, these are social places.
Yes.
And yet, in a political arena, Jan, it's always about money. It's always about money. Every issue that comes before our city council, we're a city of 125,000, our budget's 375 million, and we get to spend that each year. And there's 7 of us on the city council. And so it always comes down to money, operating costs and versus revenues. And so although it's a social end, money's always up front and central to concern.
But there are so many things that aren't costed and cannot be costed. And that is the problem, really, isn't it?
It really is, because here's my dilemma as a politician. Everybody who runs for a political office in my city runs on a platform of no new taxes. We will not raise taxes.
No.
I can go in there and make the political case and the social case for doing parks, but I won't get elected. You know, that's the conundrum of this.
No.
You know, and that's obviously the appeal of these misleading numbers, which we still use today. I mean, I'm going, you know, I see, for example, economic impact numbers of athletic fields, and they're blown out of all proportion. Well, as a social scientist and economist, I know they're blown out of proportion. But do I make that kind of point on the council when I want parks?
No.
I have to confess the answer is no, but I should.
No.
And I'd like to just jump in here for a minute. You know, I think historically, I think there were people who did realize these calculations were off. If you look at the Minneapolis park system around between 1890 and 1901, William Watts Fowell, who's the president of the Park Commission, in his annual report writes about the improvement problem, in which he states, hi, our calculations are off, and that we will never be able to maintain and improve the lands that we've acquired, so based solely on these tax revenues. And so they start to actually lobby the city government for additional standard taxes, right? To levy a higher tax rate on all of the city inhabitants, not just the sort of local real estate aspect. And so I think it's interesting, because I think there is a recognition beginning in the early 20th century. And I think Weir's Manual of Parks probably talks about this. That was published in 1928. It was sort of a national look at the financing and construction of parks across the United States. And it's a 1,000-page tome. It's huge. It has a lot of information on it. So I think, the point about cherry picking is probably the most apt. And, when you're trying to get it built, perhaps, is when these financial arguments most appear. And then when you're trying to maintain or improve, then we start to rely more on city taxes, perhaps, at least in the case of Minneapolis. And I think there's an interesting issue about park design and development. Is it's not just about initial construction, it's also about maintenance, ongoing upkeep as well, and the cost of that. And at some point in Minneapolis, they basically say, parks, they figure out probably around 1930 that parks will never pay for themselves. And this is after they try to do it through concessions fees for things like golf courses. But I think we probably, as a field, don't look at these financial issues of park development enough. and think about how the calculus is made between the social benefits and the financial costs, or not made, perhaps, to respond to.
Just a couple of reactions, Heidi. The first one is that, as I understand it, Minneapolis was built very much by the Elwood Act, and you know, which sort of created special districts. And so a neighborhood would say, we'd like a park, and the parks director would come along and say, well, that's fine. We'll put a surcharge on each of the houses within a 6-block range. And the surcharge will depend on how close you are to the park. And if you vote in favor, we'll build your park. Which I guess ultimately was thrown out by the courts after about 30 years or so, because it favored wealthy areas at the expense of poor areas. And the other thing is that I was critical of people of the cost estimates, but the reality is, of any major cost, any major project in America today or any place else, you can pretty much guarantee there'll be a cost overrun. And the reason for that, based on my own political life in my own community, is that when we project costs, we project everything will happen as the specs say, and as the staff tell us, and so on. And it never does. There's always unexpected things occur. They found some harder rock they didn't want, or there's a recession, or so costs invariably on large projects get out of hand. And once you've started on one of these, you've got the sunk cost problem. You've got the money sunk in it, so you perpetuate, you keep going, you keep going, you keep going. So you get these massive overruns now. And so the name of the game in parks, for, if you're really an advocate, is just get them started. The numbers don't matter. Use whatever lies you like to get your numbers, because once they've got some money sunk into it, they got to keep going. And highly unethical. But that's the reality of what happens in a lot of political life around here. People get the council committed to something, and the costs just spiral and spiral and spiral, and you're stuck with it. You can't just leave a half-abandoned whatever stuck there. So this is a more generic problem than just parks, but it has played a major role in the spread of parks, both in the United Kingdom and in the United States.
Thank you very much for this very interesting conversation. Is there any more questions before we call off?
I just want to follow up on what Heidi was saying. I agree with Heidi that I think in large measure people knew that the economics didn't quite work out. But also, if you go back far enough into the 19th century, there was such a firm belief that the social benefits were worth that if numbers were fudged, and I'm not saying Olmsted fudged them, but the ends probably did justify the means in their mind. If you look at Olmsted's Yosemite and Mariposa Big Trees report, for example, he has about one sentence in there on the economics, and then goes on for paragraphs and paragraphs about what he felt were the psychological and social benefits of preserving Yosemite. So it's clear that that's where the mindset was. And it was very much based on how important they felt all of this was to civilization. And unlike what Robert was saying about the UK, in the United States, you have parks happening simultaneously with orphanages, with the importance of schools, public schools, the importance of even railroads, for example, setting aside lands, giving lands for church lots and all of that kind of stuff. So there's sort of moral and psychological benefits that they saw, whether those hold water today is a question, but they believed in that wholeheartedly.
Surely the benefits of public parks are even more relevant today if we think of everything that happens. So thank you very much, everyone, for these very, very good presentations, which give a different perspective. Our next session will be in 3 months' time, because we are not having any presentation during the summertime. So it's going to be the 28th of September. I think we lost Robert, lost his connection. So I will conclude for him. He will send an email about the in-person event, which we plan to do still in October. So you will have more information and you'll be able to share your thoughts with us as well. Thank you very much, all the speakers and all participants, and see you after the summer.
Thank you. Bye.
Marie.
Thank you.
Thank you.